This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and the rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother in Oklahoma City. There is a phrase that we hear almost every day that has created the contours of the world that we live in. In fact, it has created the system by which we live and in which we operate day by day. This phrase isn't especially complicated, nor is it some sort of secret we keep from the kids. The matter of the fact is that you've probably said it 20 times today, as have I. We've given no more thought to it than we've given to the fact that the sun has risen in the eastern sky. And since it is so common, the fact is that we've probably not spent 1 second thinking about it or its usage in our lives at all. All the while, the sentiment it expresses and the life it reveals are at work among us in just about every way. And that phrase is, I want. Now, as I write this, I'm sitting at the table on the porch of an acquaintance of mine. As I look out over the lawn, the outdoor dog has come up to me to nuzzle my knees. What he wants is for me to reach over and to pet him for a while. I want to write and get my thoughts down on paper, but the dog is relentless. He wants to get my attention. In fact, he won't leave my left hand alone until I stop and reach over to pet his head for a minute or two. And when I do that, he leaves. And not just that, he withdraws from the table, seemingly contented for a moment. Then he jumps up his nose in the air and tears around the railing of the porch, barking and whining to go after what looks like a squirrel that has caught his attention. His muscles cycling under his skin like the treetops undulating in a stiff breeze. He runs to the hedge and barks and put his nose down to sniff for a moment, and then seeing the squirrel tail hop away, he relaxes and comes to lie down again back at the table. Apparently, what he wants is immediate and straightforward. And once he's either successful or frustrated, he seems to be content. When we experience want appears to be woven into our being as animals. The animals around me move in response to a stimulus that appears to awaken in them the impulse to move towards some object or experience. What these animals desire or want isn't always clear to me. It could be the case that I'm anthropomorphizing what I see and imputing what's happening to them, presuming it is the same kind of experience that happens in me. And while I notice the dog, I also see a hummingbird flying up to a flower and placing his probe into it. It looks like he wants to have the first meal of the day. But is this really what he wants, or is it a more direct push from deep inside his tiny brain's programming? Does he fly around wanting something in terms of identifying a need or a preference and then analyzing the options and exercising his choices and then goes out and gets what he'd like? That seems unlikely. After all, when we see an amoeba under the microscope moving towards some object and then engulf it, it's hard for us to imagine that this tiny animal wants lunch. It's more likely to imagine its programming is set for it to sense some stimulus and then have some response, with no more notion of wanting something than a fire alarm wants to beep when it senses smoke. Probably the sense response is something like the process of its interior machinery simply switching on, and maybe the hummingbird is some version of that. But the dog, that seems to be different. The dog wants me to pet him. This doesn't seem to be part of its machinery exactly. Perhaps it is. Maybe my notion of its want to be petted is something I've attributed to him, an imposition of my reading of what he's doing. Perhaps the dog's want is no more than what it means to be a dog. It's as tightly wound into its wiring and machinery and has no more meaning to the world or to the dog than the amoeba's move toward its prey. After all, we keep dogs for a reason. Perhaps this dog response to come and be petted by me is simply what it means to be a dog and is as unremarkable to the dog as the fact that it has 4 feet and a mane. Slipping up to nuzzle my hand means only that he's being the dog that he is. Except, of course, that we're around dogs that are not like that. This dog is gentle and calm and likes to be around strangers. Not all dogs are like that. In fact, were they all like that, they might not have been domesticated at all. We would never have kept them if all they were was desperate to be petted. So in some measure, there seems to be another option available for being a dog, at least among those who can choose between different breeds or even just different dogs. This particular Fido simply is one whose wiring has been connected this way. So it's not supine and associative. Or is it a combination of the characteristics of its breed and of the dog himself? Or is it the fact that wanting has nothing to do with dogs and it exists as a word we use only because we're human beings and we're willing to ascribe this want to them? Maybe when we use the word for want for dogs, it's in the same way we use the word good to describe both a good wine and a good baby. The word describes something we acknowledge, and they're related in usage, but how wine is good and how a baby is good are different things. But it gets us thinking. I know what I mean when I say I want something. I'm impelled by some desire on my part to want what I want. And my life has been defined in many respects by what I do when I feel this want in me and when I began to act on it. There arises in me a feeling of lack or insufficiency. I know this feeling, and I know that there may be a way to find what will satisfy it. I have felt want for things before, and I've satisfied this want. Perhaps I can satisfy this one that I now feel. So as I feel it, I move through my options for what's available to me, and I begin the process of satisfying the want I feel. Or it's something like that. It's a deep, intricate feeling, so it's hard to detail exactly. And part of the intricacy is that this isn't exactly my history with wanting. After all, when I was a baby, I wanted to nurse, but I had no more idea of what I wanted than that. I guess no more than stimulus and response. I moved to what was there, and it satisfied me. St. Augustine described what he must have felt when he was a child nursing, and he drew a long set of conclusions based on what he had seen of other babies, and he imputed that to his own life. This stimulus and response seems to have been the case with me. But we grow up, and we grow out of our notion of wanting. It becomes something more than simply satisfying some sort of deep stimulus. Maybe we grow into our dog phase, where what we want is more like the dog nuzzling than a baby nursing. We want the things we want based on what would be a preference to us, something on a level removed from what's strictly necessary, but that what we really do want. A child that wants to be held isn't quite an amoeba moving toward its food. It seems to be more like a dog that wants to be petted. The dog and the child have options, it seems. This dog of my acquaintance doesn't want or need to be petted always, just intermittently and just for a few moments. A child to be held seems to be something like this. We move, of course, to a whole different level of wanting as we become older. Our wants become more facile and, at the same time, more deep. That seems like a paradox. Perhaps it's simply a way to say that our wants become more complicated. By more facile, I mean that we become aware that our wants are mobile and can be prompted by all kinds of stimuli. Watch a commercial and suddenly we think it would be a great idea to have some Doritos. Or even if we don't want them right then, we see the bag at the grocery store and recall what we felt when we watched the advertisement. And at the end of the process, we want the chips, so we get them. Even when we know it's all artificial, and we can choose to follow up on this want or just ignore it, it is something we do want, and it does prompt our choosing. And we all know there's 1,000 wants like this. And it's the first thing we normally mean when we use the word. That is, it's not simply an impulse or just a motive force. What we want is what is presented to us as an option. We don't need Doritos. We want them. And when we decide to get them, we're making a decision about how to translate this want into an action. We realize just how shallow that is, which is a part of the decision we make, since we're not compelled to it by some deeper force or need. I want, in this sense, means, although I can do without it, I'd prefer to have it. But in addition to this part of our experience, there is the awareness that our wants show themselves as an aspect of ourselves that do lie deep within us. Thanks to Freud and the modern psychological movements of the 20th century, we know that noticing and then naming what we want is also part of deeper motives and energies within us. Most everyone presumes that whatever we want is a way we begin to understand the true self that we are, the one pulling the strings in our lives that direct us and to shape our decisions. It's common for us to imagine that when we hear someone say, "I want to have a Mercedes," or a milkshake, or a successful career, or whatever, that they're really disclosing something else about their lives. We presume the motive force for their wanting is something other than a car or a drink or a job. Their wanting is a way to picture some deeper thing at the heart of their lives. Wants go deep. That's what we really believe. We recognize there are some very deep and basic wants that propel a lot of what we do. We use the words, "I want to eat," when we feel hungry. And we would tend to use it to describe both the feeling of being a little peckish around noontime, although we just had breakfast a couple of hours before. But we use the same word as well when we haven't eaten the whole day before and are really, truly hungry. It's a version of the same want, which is to satisfy the need we had to have enough food to sustain ourselves, even if the experience the word references seems to be in a completely different category. But if we think about it, the want is there, and it's real in both cases, even when in the latter it's felt in an imperative way that's not felt in the former. If we think about it, we could say that the origin of both is the same place, even if the feelings are pretty different. In fact, there are many people who presume all our wanting is not much more than the reaction of the amoeba. At this deep level of ourselves, we're just responding to the stimuli that activates our basic machinery, they say. It could be that we have a sophisticated pictorial way of imagining these wants, and so they look and sound different in different places and times, but they're not much more than automatic reflexes that are designed to keep us alive, or maybe just to keep us entertained. If we want to see into the true depths of a person, it is said, we only have to have him describe what he wants, and then we'll know him. That tends to be a bit unhelpful, not because it's not true, but because it's true only up to a point. I know my friendly dog will turn away after I choose not to respond, and I know the person who wants the Doritos can pause for a moment and consider some other factors, like his heart health or his waistline, and decide that he doesn't really want them. In short, there is an element of freedom involved in the translation of my wants into my actions. I'm not only the sum of my wants, I'm also something, someone else. I am something more than the sum of my wants. There is there in the deepest part of myself that is greater than the amoeba of stimulus and response. If there isn't, then all the me I know is simply an elaborate smokescreen to hide the operation of my machinery from myself and from others. Does anyone think we are no more than the simple accumulation of the stuff we want? Oh, sure, we're not only the stolid, impassive self we might imagine, the person who lives at the bottom of all of our wanting and getting. One description of being a person is that the person that we are, is the accumulation of the personalities we carry around with us all the time. The person we could become if we had not eaten in 5 days is frightening to imagine, if only because we have a hint of who we might become if that were the case. Or what has been recorded of regular soldiers who are driven by vengeance and are turned loose on a helpless city with the guarantee that they won't be held responsible for what they do for the next 36 hours. That is gruesome. They become like a different person, as if they were possessed. Regular guys turn into monsters, or at least they freely do monstrous things. We also know that a man who has been nurtured and supported by a caring spouse becomes domesticated in the best sense of things. He becomes a different type of man, awakened to the potential for goodness and responsibility. Each one of his sub-personalities, they're there in him. They're there in us, as if they were gears and chains waiting only for the first turn to move and mesh and produce what they're made for. I, quote unquote, am a lot more complicated than I give myself credit for, and not nearly as simple as I imagine. But we also know that our wants are real to us. They propel us toward the life we lead. What we want is what gives directions to our actions. And we know our wants are mobile. They can lead us almost anywhere. Growing up, we learn to corral what we want. Partly, this is to help us make it through the day, since we can't simply run around chasing whatever we want that happens to pop up in our vision. If we simply followed each attractive thing or each notion appearing before our eyes, we'd never really get anything done. In Dante's Inferno, his first vision of hell was the huge crowd of people running around outside of the gates there, following one banner after another, reacting in unison like flocks of birds suddenly turning in the air. These are those who are not particularly evil. They're simply carried away in their lives by their inability to focus on what is valuable and important. They didn't really make it into hell in its grossest punishment, but they're not in eternal happiness either, because they spent their lives rushing from one thing to another. It's not that our wants don't lead us. They do. But unless they're disciplined, they don't take us anywhere, because we never follow them down. It's only when we begin to analyze our wants and make decisions about them that they can take us somewhere meaningful. The irony, of course, is that this is the manifestation of a deeper want. But we all recognize this truth. Until we make a decision about our wants, we'll never unlock the deep machinery of life. A mature adult is distinguished from a child and an adolescent, at least partly by the depth of the wants he pursues. Fulfilling the want for a career is different than fulfilling the want for a new car. Having a family is different than having a swimming pool. Getting a new home is more substantial than getting a new pair of shoes, or 1,000 pairs of shoes. By identifying what will satisfy us and then fulfilling that want, we enter into the fuller part of the potential for our lives. In the past, this part of our humanity was understood and appreciated, a lot more than today. The wants of our lives were factored into the definition of being a human being. It wasn't especially difficult or disagreeable to claim the wants of a decent life, and they were very much the same for the whole society. In fact, a society could be identified and named by the wants of its members. And to tell the truth, in the past, the options available for its members were limited in a society. By adulthood, most of the members were well aware of the passing foibles of facile wants and knew that life was defined by fulfilling the deep ones rather than those shallow ones. And let's face it, the facile ones were limited and silly, which made the deep ones important and necessary. The people of those times achieved notable lives by their fulfillment of their wants, often at an almost impossible to imagine early age, because they pursued deep wants. The stories of the Catholic priests who volunteered to go to Elizabethan England to serve in the church's mission there is an example of this unimaginable willingness. To go to serve there was a death sentence. Far more than half the men who went were, in fact, captured and tortured and killed. And because their service to the Catholic Church was defined as treason to the crown, those who were captured were tortured horribly as part of their execution. And yet, the men kept going. Many times, their stories included making the decision to return to England after having become a Catholic as the result of a single conversation with the rector of the seminary who prepared these men. One conversation, and they were ready to surrender their lives to the butchers on the gallows, all because they wanted to fulfill their desire to serve the Lord in the church. We can hardly imagine such decisions. In our day and time, with our prosperity and its expansion of what is available to us, we seem to be lost on the surface of things. No one considers it odd that a man of 25 years has never even hinted at following any want that's deep-seated and truly meaningful, but has instead directed his life only to fulfill the merest and meagerest wants in his life. There are, after all, so many options and so many things. It feels odd to imagine they could be ignored in favor of some other class of wants, even if those wants are the very definition of a purposeful life. The Gospels present us with some interesting invitations concerning wanting. When Jesus encounters a leper, for example, who's cried out to him for help, Jesus first asks him what he wants. It's an odd question, we presume, because who wouldn't want to be cleansed and cured? But Jesus knows not everyone wants what's obviously good or certainly purposeful. Many people want the opposite of those things. In the pursuit of what Christ can offer, clarifying our wants is part of what we receive. When Jesus encountered the Samaritan woman at the well, and after she admitted that she wanted to receive the living water that he offered to her, he told her to go call her husband. She admitted that she didn't have a husband, and then we find out from Jesus that she's had 5 husbands. Jesus' direction to her to tell her husband seems cruel, a case of rubbing her failures in her face. Except that Jesus wants her to clarify what it is that she truly wants, a clarity that has escaped her when it's come to marriage. Knowing our wants, knowing their hierarchy and depth, is part of life in Christ. Or when Jesus encountered Andrew and Philip following him, he turned to them and asked, "What do you seek?" They had to clarify their purpose. This was at least as important for them as it was for Jesus. Without knowing what they wanted, they wouldn't know if they were to find it in him or not. It does not seem to be the case that we're simply response machines. We have the capacity to sort out the wants of our lives so as to provide our lives with greater depth and meaning. And Jesus is part of this great sorting. But there's another even greater element. Since our wants are part of our makeup, they're also our pathway available to God's work in us, pathways leading us to the meaning of our lives. Sorting out our lives is a work all of us are impelled to do. Jesus invites us to follow this pathway all the way to healing and wholeness and heaven. It makes sense, of course. We share the makeup of the world with all beings that are part of it. Whether hummingbirds or blue whales or human beings, we interact with the world to find and then fulfill the wants in our lives. If God wants us to be fulfilled in our lives, this fulfillment will be in line with how we are made and not opposed to it. We're invited to say yes to ourselves and to our makeup as we say yes to God. The Christian life is a life of positive affirmation of who and what we are, rather than a negation of how we are and how we're made. When the psalmist says that our encounter with God is deep calling to deep, that's what he means. If we listen, the call we hear is the very voice of God speaking to us in all the wants we know. We have only to know it's Jesus' voice to listen to. To go to the deepest part of ourselves, we only have to repeat what we've been given in his example. As the swirl of our wants and desires buffet us in our time and create the headwinds of our society, we can repeat what Jesus said as he directed his own wants. We can always say, "Into your hands, Father, I commend my spirit." With that, our wants can be satisfied. Back in just a moment. Welcome, Oklahoma, to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called True Love. If it were only love, and I were loved to the depth of myself, my cup would run over and my banks burst, and my heart soar as a dove, nothing false or subbed, all made full and all helped, this gift of life would forever be first. But it is only life, and I have been mistaken, left empty and barren, a cratered ruin in a rocky landscape. The real world a subtle knife, excised all false and fake in, my hope to give and care in, all my heart would feel and my hands take. Unless there is an ideal of true love and real, being beyond the mere me here and now, soaring above the clouds of clotted time. A lifetime's final seal will only blind true seeing, all things felt will sway and bow, stumbling finally with no thought to rise or climb. That's true love. I hope to join us in the weeks to come here at Living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.